killing everything in our path. And so I think that whoever it is that has created us, had created us, I believe, possibly already knew that in the far future, once this race is finally brought up to speed, and then we can move it to the next plateau. And this is what the Nazis were talking about. This is what Werner von Braun was talking about. The Nazis were big on this subject and using the symbol and the term that I'm talking about, the symbol between the mountains of the East. England, and interesting about this is England has always had a fixation on Egypt. England's big on Egypt, and go to the British Museum and all these different museums. The English were always big on Egypt, but the Germans were not. The Germans were always big on Iraq. That's what Germany was interested in, Babylon. And the reason why, I think, is because the Nazis and the German people in general, or at least the intelligentsia of the German establishment, realized this story that I'm trying to explain has to do with Babylon, it has to do with Iraq, and I believe that may be one of the reasons why the U.S. is in Iraq today.
Absolutely.
It has something to do with and I know this is true because I can prove that the symbols which are being used by the U.S. government today in Iraq is exactly the same symbols that I was telling you about that comes from the Anunnaki, from the Phoenician Canaanites, the Syrians, the Phoenicians, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Britannia, into America. The entire superstructure of civilization has been using the same word and terms and symbol that is today dominating in Iraq, but most people don't even know. They don't even see it. It's hidden in plain sight.
Okay, but there is a Stargate in Iraq that's fairly well known. That Saddam Hussein, apparently they had to get rid of him because he had found it and was able to control it while he was in power.
Yeah.
So in essence, the U.S. is never. I mean, it's been my theory that the U.S. is never going to leave Iraq, because basically they have to man that Stargate. They have to have control of that Stargate, which is where it is said the Anunnaki will return, through that Stargate. Have you heard that theory?
Well, yeah, I have, absolutely. And one of my favorite speakers on that subject is William Henry. And William and I have been around the world together and went to Egypt together. We talked a long time about Stargates. I understand the story. I didn't say anything about Stargates. That's William Henry's work that influenced me in that direction. But I am aware that Hollywood is talking about Stargates. They're making movies about it. And I did a lecture series with Al Bielek and Preston Nichols. I did 2 weekend seminars in which the 3 of us spoke together back in Philadelphia, and I had some time to sit and talk with Preston Nichols. And incidentally, I am highly impressed with Preston Nichols.
Okay.
You have to be highly impressed with that man when you sit and talk with him.
Okay.
Because he is a very, very interesting man. He's got a lot of very good information on the kind of thing I'm talking about in private with him. And he was enlightening me to some of the things I'm seeing and saying.
But he's heavily involved in the Montauk story.
Absolutely.
And the Philadelphia experiment
Right.
being the early precursor of that. And then also time travel,
Exactly.
which is where Montauk was headed. And then you get into the Stargates and
Right.
so on. And this has something to do with letting in. Now I'm theorizing here, so I want you to help me. But my understanding with the Montauk project was that there were some openings made in not just the timeline, but also in space, so to speak, where certain races were able to come in through an open door, basically, that was created by the Montauk project. And I'm wondering if that has to do with the genetic engineering of our planet, such that they were coming in to do a job.
Well, yeah, I think all of that has some validity. I don't know that much about the Stargate itself concept. I understand it, but I mean, that's not my subject, but it plays into my subject as part of it. And it must be important because Hollywood's making movies about it all the time, and they actually have television shows, Stargate. So I'm sure there's something very legitimate about the concept. All I'm saying is that when I was talking and spent two weekends with Al Bielek and Preston Nichols and myself, I was very impressed with both Al Bielek and Preston Nichols, because in my opinion, sitting with them for hours on end and working with them over the weekend, both of them are extremely interesting, provocative people that have just got a lot, and I was having fun downloading all this stuff to Preston, and he's saying, yeah, well, here's something else you didn't see. And so I have the highest regard
that's
for...
wonderful to hear, actually,
Yeah.
because I do think there's great validity there and some very important...
I think Preston Nichols is absolutely
clues.
sensational. I love everything. He was such a gracious and such a gracious person, helpful, kind, courteous, and brilliant to sit and talk with. So I love Preston
I hear
Nichols.
you. Now, what about Zecharia Sitchin? When he talked about the Anunnaki, there was a group of the Anunnaki that went to Mars, that left this planet, and then actually, some of which I guess came from wherever the Anunnaki came from, and never actually even made it here. So there's a group that kind of went back to Mars, and then some that came from, according to Sitchin. And so what I'm wondering is, what was going on with Mars? And we know that Hoagland has gone down that road quite a distance. But I think that you've given him many of the clues and the basis for his work. And there's something to do with, now I'm not an expert on this, but I do understand that the positioning of the Great Pyramid and the significance with the association with Mars, and then of course we're talking about Babylon, and Babylon and Mars are symbols for the same thing, isn't this right? And the Whore of Babylon, and there's something going on there. And
That's right.
Maybe
That's what I'm talking about.
Talk about that a little bit, about Mars and the significance with the Anunnaki and where that might be leading.
And the very word Cairo, as you probably know, Cairo means Mars.
Exactly.
That's
so
another word for Mars.
What
is
is
Cairo.
going on with that?
Yeah. That is a subject which Richard is probably better suited to talk about than I, because I really haven't looked at Mars over and above the general kind of stuff he talks about. But yeah, I totally believe for myself that Mars is inhabited. And I do believe that there's probably humans like us there. What was his name? Quite a long time ago, I had a long conversation in Mesa, Arizona with Virgil Armstrong Postlethwaite. Virgil Armstrong and I sat in a restaurant in Mesa, Arizona many years ago and talked about the people who were on Mars. And Virgil was the guy, from what I gather, was the man who came up with the idea. He was a military CIA operative, and he's the guy that came up with the idea for Green Berets. That was his idea, Green Beret, and he worked with the CIA. And so I loved sitting and talking with Virgil Armstrong. But he brought out about how, in that conversation, how there were many thousands of people or more like us, humans like us, on Mars at that time. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised.
What year was this that you were talking about?
This was probably 50, that was probably 80, mid-80s.
Amazing.
I would say 85, 86, 87, something like that.
Okay, well that does dovetail also with our experience with our witness Henry Deacon. Arthur Neumann is his real name. He's come out under that name recently and said he's been to Mars. So I'm wondering if you have any information that's come to you about jump gates, about going between planets.
Well, yes and no. The only thing I have of any value was someone else's work. I sat and talked with him. And he is a very, very knowledgeable, very legitimately. When he worked for the United States Naval Observatory, he was in charge of the Naval Observatory, and he just passed away just recently. But his website is so extraordinary. The stuff he's got, the stuff he has on that website, pictures of of strange things found on